Our first speaker today was once an intelligent officer for MI5, the UK security service. But in 1996, she blew the whistle and told the world about the spies' incompetence and the crimes they committed. Today, Annie Machon is a writer, speaker, campaigner, consultant. And this is a story about what she calls the war on concept and how we all can make a difference. Welcome, Annie Machon.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a real privilege to be able to speak here today at what is primarily a public sector focused conference. So coming out of the public sector originally myself, I'm very, very pleased to be here. When I was flying over yesterday to Stockholm, I was idly flicking through the in-flight magazine, as you do, and I came across an article about a Danish musician who is currently living and working in Berlin. And she used a phrase which, even though I spent a lot of time in Berlin myself, I had never heard before. And this was the citizen of glass. And I thought, this must be a hangover from the Stasi days in East Germany, where they saw their citizens, they knew everything about them, allegedly, and therefore they were transparent. But I thought, what a wonderful phrase, because not only does it indicate that enforced transparency, but it also indicates, in my view, that it makes the citizen very fragile as well, easily shattered. So today I want to talk a little bit about the sort of big overarching issues that currently are putting all of us in the position of being glass citizens. As Katarina very kindly mentioned, I started my working life in MI5 as an intelligence officer. This was way back in the 1990s. And I was there for 6 years, and during that time I met my former partner and colleague, a man called David Shaler, who became a very famous, infamous whistleblower, particularly in the UK in the late 1990s. We were there for 6 years each. We worked in 3 different sections: political subversion or extremism, Irish terrorism, and international terrorism. And in that time, only that brief time, we saw so many things going wrong that we felt compelled to resign and to blow the whistle. These things we saw included files on government ministers, files on hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens for their political activities, illegal bomb plots, bombs that should and could have been prevented, which exploded on UK streets, and innocent people were killed. There was illegal telephone tapping cases against famous journalists. Well, no change there now. There was a case where 2 innocent Palestinians were sent to prison, even though MI5 had evidence of their innocence and withheld it from the trial. And finally, there was the case that made us quit, which became known as the Gaddafi assassination plot. And this was way back in 1996, where MI6, our sister organization, like the American CIA, funded Al-Qaeda in Libya to try and assassinate Colonel Gaddafi. Now, this is illegal under every which way. You are not allowed to assassinate foreign heads of state. In the UK, you're not allowed to carry out such plots without the prior written permission of your political master, the Foreign Secretary, which they did not get. So it was illegal, and it killed innocent people. So we couldn't think of anything more heinous than that, and that's why we resigned, and we went public. Roll forward, of course, to 2011, and the very same forces toppled Colonel Gaddafi and had him murdered. And I'm concerned about the moral slide that in 1996 this was top secret, and the whistleblowers had to go to prison for exposing it, whereas in 2011 the same activities were carried out in the full glare of the international media, and none of us really cared. So I think this is a dangerous path for our societies to be going down. But just to summarize, we went public, and because we were intelligence officers, we realized that we would automatically go to prison for exposing the crimes of the spies. So we fled the country preemptively and went on the run literally around Europe. We ended up living in hiding in a remote French farmhouse for a year, and then another 2 years living more openly but in exile in Paris. David Shaler went to prison not once but twice for exposing the crimes of the spies. First of all, when the British failed to extradite him from France, he was imprisoned there. And then, after he'd returned voluntarily, stood trial and was, of course, automatically found guilty. So he paid a very heavy price. I was also arrested. Family members were arrested. Student journalists who supported us were arrested, and also mainstream journalists were arrested around this case as well. So it was a huge scandal at the time. And I suppose I would say that we were the sort of analogue Edward Snowdens. I think we were the only whistleblowers I know of, apart from him, who have preemptively gone on the run in order to remain at liberty to argue their case. So what did I learn from this? I think two key lessons. One was quite startling to me. I'm the daughter of a journalist myself, the granddaughter of a journalist, and I always thought that the free press was there to speak truth to power. And in this case, it was startling that the headlines coming out around David Shayler said precisely the opposite of what was going on in the courtroom, for example. So in the final ruling, the judge said that Shayler had done what he'd done in the public interest, that there was no financial motivation, and no lives had been put at risk. The headlines the next day all said precisely the opposite. Shayler sells agent lives down the river for money. I was like, where did that come from? Some parallel universe? Which got me thinking, how is the media so easily controlled? And in the UK, they are incredibly tightly controlled, both by soft power, where they induct the journalists into the charmed secret circle, and by hard power, a whole raft of laws, up to and including the Official Secrets Act, which prosecutes journalists as well as whistleblowers. The other key lesson I took away from those years was, particularly when we were on the run, was the notion of living with no privacy. Because we had been the gamekeepers turned poachers, we knew how they would come after us. We knew that if we were investigating us, we would deploy a whole range of resources. So we knew our electronic communications were bugged, our home was bugged, including, by the way, our bedroom, think about it. The only psychological defense we had to that was that we were having way more fun than they were. And also the suspicion that there would be agents run in against us. And we found out afterwards that indeed 3 of our friends had been pressurized and turned to report back on us. So imagine living like this for years. You can't even have a gossip on the telephone with your mother because you begin to self-censor what you say in case it's being picked up and listened to. And this was very corrosive to my personal human spirit. And I think now we understand the full horror of this blanket surveillance that Edward Snowden has laid bare. It's very corrosive for our societies to think like that. And in fact, in the UK, there was a very famous poll conducted, and it showed that 28% of UK adults had changed their online activity because of the Snowden disclosures. They were worried about what might be picked up by the spies, and rightly so. So this is why I've become a very strong advocate for privacy. It is a fundamental human right, because without privacy, without that freedom to conduct our lives in private, our banking, our health, our social interactions, our activism, our love lives, whatever, then we lose free agency as informed and active citizens. And once we lose that, we lose our democracy. We saw this in the run-up to the Second World War, the slide to German totalitarianism. So this is a real problem as well. So from those lessons, I became very involved in a number of political activities, and I want to cover some of these. These are what I call my war on concept subjects. And I suppose because of my background now, I take a very unorthodox perspective on many of the big issues of the day. So the first of these wars, I call the war on drugs. Now this is probably the oldest one. It's been around for at least 40 years. And I speak as someone who served for 4 years as the European Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. This is a global organisation of police and lawyers and judges, prison governors, probation officers, ex-spies, customs officers, and even the odd international drug czar. And because of our professional experience, we all now come together and we say, the war on drugs is a failure on every level. Now, I know that the drug laws are quite draconian in Sweden compared to most of the rest of Europe. But even at the local level, you see the breakdown of the trust between the police and the policed. It affects community relations. It penalises people who develop health problems from dependencies. And it's only about 15% of the users that do go on to develop these dependencies. You know, if you say someone's a drug user, they're not all running around injecting heroin on the streets. And also as well, if you look at the global perspective of what the drug war has involved, one, it has given, particularly America, a perfect excuse to intervene, invade, interfere with the politics of other sovereign states around the world, particularly in Latin America. And this has led to huge levels of violence. It has also created a global crime wave, which we've never seen before. And the global trade in drugs, the illicit profits every year are estimated by the UN to be between 320 billion and $500 billion per year. These are big bucks, big stakes, leading to big violence and the subversion of whole regions around the world. Plus, one of the other lesser-known facts of this is that, in fact, a number of the major terrorist organizations around the world receive the bulk of their funding from the drugs trade. Up to and including ISIS, they get a large slice of money acting as a conduit between Afghanistan and Europe. So this is a failure every which way. The second one I want to bleed into from that subject is the war on terror. I think the war on drugs will fade and finish within the next decade or two, partly because America doesn't need it anymore. They've got the shiny, bright war on terror to use as an excuse to intervene in other sovereign states around the world. And again, this is causing massive destabilization, massive social problems, and, what's it benefiting, apart from the big arms industries? And we have seen since the war on terror started with 9/11, how it has stripped away all our fundamental rights that we in the West have taken for granted since the Second World War, where people can be snatched off the streets and extraordinarily rendered, i.e. kidnapped, where they can be held in black prisons and tortured in the most barbaric and medieval ways, where they can be disappeared to Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, for decades, and where there is an assassination list every Tuesday morning that the US president is presented by the CIA, and he signs off on that. And this is a list of terrorist suspects around the world, and by signing that, he condemns them to death by drone strike. And we've seen time and time again in countries like Somalia and Yemen and Pakistan and Afghanistan that these terrorist suspects are often not terrorists. Often what is targeted are so-called gatherings of terrorist groups, which turned out to be funerals or weddings, or the gathering of village elders. Thousands of people have been killed illegally in this way. So the way that the war on terror has been misused and abused is shocking. It has destabilized whole countries, whole regions. Look at Libya, I mentioned before. Gaddafi was an odious dictator if you were a dissident, but the rest of the country thrived under him. It had the highest standard of living in any country in Africa before the toppling of Gaddafi. And look at the mess in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and of course, currently, most obviously, in Syria. The next war I would like to discuss briefly is the war, what I call, on the internet. And this goes back to the privacy issues I was talking about. We know from Edward Snowden of a whole range of ghastly dragnet surveillance programs that have been wheeled out. And just a headline with two. One is called Tempora. Has anyone heard of it? This is a horror which actually GCHQ, the NSA's counterpart in the UK, developed. It mainlines off the fibre optic cables between North America and Europe. And it hoovers up every bit of communication and can store it. It can crunch it through algorithms. And if something looks suspicious, suddenly you will be targeted. And it's illegal. The Foreign Secretary in the UK could sign a warrant to make it legal if it's against targeted groups. He cannot sign off on a warrant that covers the whole of the country. And even if he could, where on earth did he get off thinking he can sign off a warrant that would cover the whole of Europe? Because that's effectively what is happening. So this is anti-democratic. The other program I want briefly to mention is something called Optic Nerve. Again, who's heard of this? No. Has anyone watched John Oliver and heard of the dick pic program? Yeah. So this is a sort of popularization of the concept. This is where video conferencing services can be in live time intercepted. And it turns out that 10% of such communications around the world tend to be, shall we say, of a very intimate nature, between long-distance lovers, long-distance couples, or whatever. And the spies were shocked, I tell you. 10% of people are using this for this sort of thing. But I think if you're in a consensual relationship and you're separated and you want to get frisky over the internet, then it's your right to do it. You're not doing anything wrong, but I'm damn sure that most of us would want to hide that and keep it private. So all these programs begin to make us think we might be watched. Well, we are being watched. Everything is being picked up and can be stored and used against us in the future. So, for example, you might be an activist. You might go out there and protest against the environment, for the environment, or against the Syrian war or something. You're out there waving your placard. That's perfectly legal now. But what if the laws change? What if there's a government crackdown And suddenly, in the future, what you did now might be deemed to be a crime. And if this sounds fanciful, this happened to the Occupy camp in London in 2011. There were a bunch of hippies, pretty much, sitting around in tents protesting the banks. The banks were warned by the police in an official letter, though, that Occupy was a domestic extremist or terrorist organisation. So anyone who is named and identified there in the future could be scooped up as a potential terrorist. So these are all major problems. And all of this storage of our information is illegal. And we're seeing in the UK particularly, and Germany recently, pushing through bills, acts of parliament, to legalise what has previously been illegal, up to and including bulk data hacking, and the bulk hacking of personal data sets, which means scooping up whole networks of information like the National Health Service records. All our medical records can be scooped up. All our hardware can be hacked. And it turns out that MI5, GCHQ, and MI6 in the UK have been illegally doing this since 1998. And this is why they're pushing through these new wide-ranging bills in order to legalise what has previously been illegal. But nobody in the spies is being prosecuted for carrying out these crimes. And one other aspect of the war on the internet comes from the corporate aspect as well. Now, this is Sweden, of course, home of Pirate Bay. Yay! And of course, the copyright wars, the intellectual property wars, have been being waged now for about 25 years to crack down on people illegally accessing copyrighted material. And this isn't just about downloading the odd film. It's also about protecting the patents of big corporations like Monsanto, so that people cannot get access to generic drug formulas that might save their lives in poorer countries. Or they cannot get access to use foodstuffs which are suddenly patented. And in order to protect this intellectual property, these big megacorporations lobby our governments to put in measures which would allow them to go right into the nuts and bolts of the internet, deep packet inspection, to actually see what people are sending over the internet. So on the one hand, we have the megacorporations working with the governments to try and stop us freely sharing and ingesting what might be vital information. And on the other hand, we have the spies watching everything that goes through and inhibiting our wish to do that anyway, even if we can. So I see it's a ghastly pincer movement. The Second World War dictator Benito Mussolini was famously quoted as saying that fascism was the merger of the corporate and the state. And I would suggest that that is what we are edging towards ever more rapidly. Another little war on concept I just want to touch on very quickly is what I call the war on whistleblowers. Now, in my view, whistleblowers are the regulators of last resort, particularly coming out of central government, the military, and intelligence, because those are the most secretive areas of work. The whistleblowers are most penalised there, and they are probably best positioned to see the most heinous crimes being committed. Most of these whistleblowers I work with come out of America, not just Edward Snowden. There are his precursors from the NSA, including the former technical director, Bill Binney, and his associates, Kurt Wiebe and Ed Loomis, and followed on by one of their associates as well, a man called Tom Drake. All of them came out of the NSA in the last decade, and they said it was running out of control, it's breaking every law you can imagine. And they did it through the correct channels. They actually went to congressional committees and things. And yet, despite this, they were scooped up, they were arrested in dawn raids, and threatened with 35 years in prison each for doing exactly what they were allowed to do constitutionally. Obama, in his 8 years of presidency, has tried to prosecute whistleblowers under something called the Espionage Act, more times than all his predecessors since this law came into place in 1917. Now, if that is not a war on whistleblowers, I don't know what is. And let's not forget poor Chelsea Manning, languishing in prison for 35 years for exposing egregious war crimes, snuff videos, shoot-ups of children and journalists in Iraq. If you remember the video Collateral Murder, that was the first big disclosure. And yet, who is prosecuted? Not the people committing the war crimes, but the whistleblower. We see this time and time and time again. So there is indeed a war on whistleblowers, and I would advise people to look at the disclosures, call for justice around the disclosures. It's very easy for the media to sideswerve us into looking at the person. Are they pristine? Are they pure? Are they worthy of being listened to? It doesn't matter. If the facts are there, look at the facts. Just very quickly as well, one other aspect, final concept I think I would like to touch on very briefly, is what I suppose call the war on perception. And I say this because I'm looking at what is unraveling between America and Russia at the moment, and how the Western media wants us to believe one particular aspect, and of course Russia wants us to believe another. The truth is somewhere in the middle, but you would not believe that from a lot of our media. So we have the Russians illegally murdering innocent civilians in Aleppo, whereas in fact what they're doing is, with the Syrians, targeting the quarter of the city that is currently under occupation by ISIS. Whereas in Mosul at the moment, the Allied forces are freeing the grateful citizens. But actually what they're doing is exactly what the Russians are doing. They have to go after ISIS. They are bombing. They are killing innocent civilians who are being used as human shields. They are not doing anything different. But the perception in the way it is covered in our Western media is quite stark. So that's the sort of conceptual idea I wanted to run through. And I just want to sort of bring it down to our level of what we do on a day-to-day basis. You know, how does this impact on what we do as public servants? And I know we all go into the public service to serve the public. Most people don't necessarily believe that, but we do. We want to make a difference. We want to help people. We want to try and save lives, if necessary. So from all those concepts, let's look, say for example in health. When we're looking at bulk personal data set hacking, as I said, this means scooping up all the medical records and then matching them against all the other sorts of records that also can be retrieved, you know, tax or whatever it is, banks, and putting together a rounded picture of our activities and our lives. And it's very much easier, particularly in hospitals that tend to rely on proprietary software like Microsoft, these legacy systems that were imposed 15, 20 years ago. And these systems are bust. They've had backdoors built into them, makes it easy for the spies. We know that because of the PRISM program that was Edward Snowden's first disclosure. So this goes on quite routinely. So one aspect I would suggest is perhaps to say, why don't we shift away from this old legacy software, which is vulnerable, and start using open source software where it can be tailor-made, the code can be checked, so no nasty backdoors are there, and protect the records of the people that you're serving. And then look at the military as well. Of course, we know from the Nuremberg trials, there is no legal defense of I was just following orders. But of course, realistically, we all know the pressure, if you're working in that sort of environment, that you do have to follow the orders. You cannot rock the boat. Otherwise, it is, shall we say, a very career-limiting step to take. That doesn't mean that you can't ask questions, have the difficult ethical discussions. In fact, there are two young people out there, Cyan Westmoreland and Lisa Ling, who recently gave evidence to the European Parliament because they are people who used to be drone operators. And they said, this is disproportionate, it is illegal, it is not targeted enough, it's not getting the so-called terrorist suspects, it is indeed eradicating huge groups, wedding parties, innocent children. And something needs to be done to tighten this up, regulate it better, make it more targeted if we are continuing to use this system. So it's always worth asking those difficult questions. Then as well, I mean, you know, if you work in public infrastructure, the very nervous system of our countries, most of these now are pretty much run by computer software, computer programs. It's all highly automated. And yet they can be wide open to attack as well. And again, if this sounds fanciful, we know that cyber warfare is the new front line for our countries. I mean, the Russians are forever being, you know, being accused of hacking into this, that, and the other. Well, who knows? Perhaps they did hack into Hillary Clinton's emails. But if it's done the other way by America, nobody ever says a word. And a few years ago, there was a very famous case, which is called the Stuxnet virus. Try saying that fast. Again, how many of you might have heard of it? Yeah, a few. This is a real nasty, because this was cyber warfare. This was a nasty piece of malware developed to military grade by, it's suspected, America and Israel. And it was then used to infect the nuclear reactors, peaceful nuclear reactors, in Iran to attack the centrifuges system. And this, of course, you know, risks life and limb for the hapless scientists working there. But as a sort of knock-on effect, an unforeseen consequence of this, we now know that Stuxnet, as a virus, is out there. If you know where to look for it, as a hacker, for example, you can get it, you can modify it, you can turn it against other organizations, other infrastructures. So, imagine if suddenly our air traffic control system was affected by an advanced form of Stuxnet, and we have planes crashing out of the sky or something. I mean, this is how bad it can get. This is how thoughtless actions by state agencies can lead to potential huge harm across all our countries. So again, it's worth speaking out. If you have concerns, say something, even internally. And finally, as well, looking at the teaching sector, I don't know what the situation is like here, but in the UK, we've developed this very, very controversial program called Prevent, which is supposed to be outreach to the young Muslim community to help stop radicalisation. But in fact, the way it has been used and abused over the last decade means that it's become seen as a sort of snitches charter, where intelligence officers, police, go out there to try and pressurise people within the community to report back on them. But then also it's expanded so that now we have a situation where university lecturers and even teachers in primary schools, are expected under this Prevent programme to report any suspicious radicalisation amongst their pupils. And again, this is creating pushback within these classes, within the communities. The families of these pupils are just feeling more and more spied upon. And finally, with the police, as I know, I just want to return back to the LEAP aspect of things. But more and more of us are joining, and more of us realise the damage that is done to the users, to the communities on a global level about the prohibition of drugs. So a number of groups have set up recently across Europe. We've got a thriving organisation in the UK, in Germany, in Belgium, in France, and I'm always on the lookout to create new sectors, new groups. So where does this leave us all? We have a situation where we know, thanks to Edward Snowden particularly, the overarching nature of the surveillance threat. And I'm from a country which will shortly no longer be part of the EU, of course, my wonderful fellow countrymen. I'm from a country that has always exploited its relationship with the US, and this special relationship is based on the tight intelligence relationship, nothing else, because the US needed the spies' capabilities of the former British Empire after the Second World War. It needed its territories to go and build bases and all that sort of thing. So the UK and the US are the key relationship, and then beyond that we have what's known as the Five Eyes: Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all sharing everything. So this means that even if we get our governments to put in very strong laws of oversight over the spies, one, the spies can lie to them anyway, they do it time and time again, but two, even if they were to adhere to those laws strictly. So for example, GCHQ cannot spy on UK citizens within the UK. However, the Americans can, the Canadians can, Australians, New Zealanders, and then they share everything. So this is how they get around democratic oversight. And I don't think we've ever faced such a strong challenge. I mean, the internet is our nervous system now. Today, we live our lives online. It's an extension of our consciousness almost. And for that consciousness to be hacked, to be watched, to be cracked, to be stored, to be used against us in the future, as I said, is very inhibiting and, in my view, threatens democracy. We are living in a sort of global panopticon. So that's the sort of overarching aspect. But for all of us, I'm not saying, you have to go out and blow the whistle and go on the run and perhaps go to prison. Of course not, that's unrealistic. We have families, we have obligations, we have mortgages, we have community ties. We cannot do that. But what we can do, each of us in our workplace, is stand up and ask the difficult questions. Occasionally say, why are we doing this? How is this legal? Occasionally just say no. It's very empowering. And I think, in a way, that creates a sort of grit in the oyster, which can then, of course, produce the pearl. And that would be the pearl of justice, of privacy, and the defence of all our rights. So just to finish, to go back to my glass citizen. Under this global panopticon, and with all these other issues going on around it, we are indeed living as glass citizens. Everything we do online can now be watched, because we've lost this privacy. And it does make us fragile. It means that it's very difficult if we wanted to push back and get involved in a campaign to say, government, we don't like TTIP, for example. We don't like what you're doing in Syria, or whatever it is. It's very much harder then to organise effectively if the opposition already knows what you're planning. So you can't guarantee the government can protect our privacy because the spies might lie, the spies might break the law anyway. But what you can do, and this is the final point, to stop being glass citizens, is to take your privacy back into your own hands, to empower yourselves. And you can do that in many ways, but first of all, just use a suite of different internet tools. Things like open source software. Routinely encrypt your emails with PGP. Use Tor, the onion router, to anonymize what you were watching on the web. Use a virtual privacy network, again, to anonymize who you are and what you're watching on the net. Use Tails, a secure operating system. Use OTR, which I always think means on the run, it actually means off the record, for secure SMS chats. This is all possible, and they can all be freely downloaded. It's not easy necessarily unless you're a geek, but thankfully the geeks organize globally things called crypto parties. And this means you can take your laptop or whatever along to a crypto party for free, and they will help you install these sort of tools. And they're apparently quite fun as well. So if you can find one, I'm sure there are plenty in Sweden. So yes, just to finish, as I said, we're all glass citizens now, but we can all take that stand because we are still informed and active citizens. So let's all be that grit in the oyster. Let's all produce a pearl. Thank you very much.